Astrid Erll is professor of Anglophone literatures and cultures at Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. And Astrid's interests are diverse indeed, as they span English literature and comparative literature, film and also photography, cultural and media studies, media theory, and narratology. But the central element of her work has always been memory and memory theory, something that we're about to discuss together. I might also add that Astrid led a number of fascinating international projects and scholarly networks, like, for instance, the Frankfurt Memory Studies program that is broadly interdisciplinary, embracing philosophy and literature and psychology and social studies and media studies too, and thus offering the broadest comparative vision of memory as phenomenon cognitive, as much as cultural, as much as social, as much as aesthetic. I'm particularly interested in the project she currently pursues, and the title is Odyssean Travels, a literary history of cultural memory. And I do hope that we'll have a moment to discuss that a little bit as we continue. Astrid's book on memory and culture has gone through a number of editions in German, also translated into English and Spanish and Polish and Chinese. And as yet, we did not have any publications by her in Russian, but I hope very much that this can be and must be done. Maybe I should just give you the titles of some important collections that Astrid co-edited over the past dozen years, since the titles themselves show the general drift, the vector of her interests. And these are, for instance, mediation, remediation, and the dynamics of cultural memory. Audiovisual memory and the remaking of Europe. Cultural memory and the transnational term. So what we easily observe, even from this very, very shortened list, is that we deal here with a very broad vision of memory and memory studies, connecting across disciplines and connecting around the world. It is a great pleasure and honor for us to have Astrid as a speaker, and hopefully this talk, once started, would initiate more projects, Russian-based and international, and more interest in this fascinating, relatively new, but certainly not so new area. And with this, I'm just delighted to hand over to Astrid for a short introductory talk, after which we'll continue with questions, remarks, impressions, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Tatiana, first for your invitation, then for an extremely generous and knowledgeable introduction, and for bringing so many people to this room, to this workshop, something that I hadn't expected, but of course that's fantastic. So what we did is, Tatiana, we said that we would start with a 30 minutes intro by me that also reiterates a bit from the chapter which you've read, opens up probably some questions, and then you have, or your colleagues have prepared several inputs, and I was able to read them beforehand. So if you all agree, I would proceed in exactly this manner. and start my presentation. So I brought a PowerPoint presentation and I'll do a screen share now. Here we are. Okay, this seems to look good, doesn't it? Yeah. I copied Tatiana's questions on my PowerPoints because I found them so good and so to the point, and I keep them here, the general questions about memory and the literary, also for further reference when we move into our discussions. So let me start. Let me start in the way that I usually start when I teach memory study in our English program. So we have 2 different master programs on English literature, and both have something like a module on memory studies. And when I try to convey to my students what memory studies is about, I start with this slide and I tell them there's no need to do a close reading of that slide. Too many concepts, and at the same time the slide should be 10 times bigger because there are even more concepts and even more disciplines. But what this should show performatively, as it were, is that memory studies is constitutionally a transdisciplinary phenomenon. So there's not one discipline that owns memory. So you couldn't say that psychology or philosophy would be the prime approach to memory. And neither is history or sociology or whatever. So it's a transdisciplinary phenomenon. And it can only be studied in interdisciplinary fashion, I would say, in a multidisciplinary field. And that's what we are today. We are a robustly multidisciplinary field. If you look at the Memory Studies Association, so what tries to be the international representative of the field, you will find many people from sociology, politology, history, literary studies, media studies, and so on, religious studies coming in, philosophy coming in more and more classical philologies and archaeologies becoming again interested in collective memory. So memory studies is a wonderful meeting place for people from different disciplines, and it really makes for good dialogues. And I think the reason is that memory is a phenomenon that stretches in its study all the way from the natural sciences. You can do that with neurosciences and with psychology, across the social sciences, political studies, sociology, all the way to literary and media studies. So really it's a great chance of going full range, basically, in trying to understand something. And that something has different names. Sometimes it was called cultural memory, sometimes social memory, sometimes just memory. And I'm returning now to collective memory. And the thing is, it's different in all languages, and I'm sure there may be controversies in Russian as to what to call that beast. But I think most of us in the field have now agreed that it's memory we're looking at. And that's a strategic move to drop the collective or the social or the cultural and say, well, it's memory. Because even the individual memory that a classical psychologist would study and that they might imagine as something like a black box that is only in the mind, is even that in seemingly purely individual memory is thoroughly social, is thoroughly connected with our environment. So that's something that philosophies of the extended mind, distributed cognition, embodied cognition, all emphasize these days. All right, so that would be just one word about the breadth of the concept of memory, ranging all the way from individual mental capacities to what societies do in order to commemorate their past, to what digital archives do in the age of the internet these days, and so on, to popular media and to textbooks and so on and so forth. So that's to give you a sense of how wide the field is. When I introduce my students, to memory further, and they are all students of literature, I show this slide just to give them a sense of in how many different ways literature can be connected with memory. So literature has an important part in our imagination of the memory process. Think Marcel Proust à la recherche du temps perdu. Or because I guess there are anglicists, many anglicists here, think about the ways that Virginia Woolf represents memory processes in Mrs. Dalloway. Of course, literature and the genre of the historical novel is an important medium and mode of disseminating popular images of the past. So in a sense, ever since Waverley, we have that literary genre that has become so important and has become adapted into the historical film and then transmuted into the many documentaries of history TV that we see these days. There is another source of the literary, or the literary as a source for collective memory, and that would be testimonials, literary testimonials, forms of witnessing in literature. And I put Primo Levi here. You could also put Art Spiegelman's Maus as a form of not witnessing, but secondary witnessing of the post-memory of a second generation about the Holocaust. I won't go into the Ars Memoria today, but there is a long tradition in rhetorics and in aesthetics and literary writings that connects places with images in the tradition of ancient thought, of ancient rhetoric. And last not least, we often use the term memory quite metaphorically in order to speak or to frame processes of intertextuality, transtextuality, adaptation, reception, or whatever the term is that tries to make us understand how literature has that diachronic dimension where it continues to reference itself. All right. So what you read is a piece from that book, Memory in Culture. And before I move on to that chapter number 6, which you have read, let me quickly say reiterate what I say in chapters number 3 and 4. In a very simplified way, I imagine culture and memory culture as something that we could heuristically subdivide into 3 dimensions: a social, a more material, a more social, or more mental dimension. And for literary scholars, we enter that field of memory culture through the material dimension, okay? What we can do is we study mnemonic artifacts, we study aesthetic media, the literary, the film, and so on. So that's one important part of memory culture, but it's never alone. Also, if it's alone, it is not the memory culture. It only can become collective memory when it interacts with the social dimension, with people who carry the memory, who make the art, who receive the art, who make sure that the art is being printed and read and so on. So you see the entire social side here. In older times, the shamans, the priests, the church, the university, the commemorative rituals would have been part of the social institutionalization. Today, it could be marketing strategies in order to bring popular films about history into circulation. That is, for me, the social dimension. If you are from film studies, you might want to call it the industrial dimension, but it's needed in order to bring literature into the social realm, make it read, make it durable. And these two play together in order to create, and they are at the same time performed by the mental dimension of memory culture. And that will be in mnemonic communities, shared schemata, concepts, codes, values and norms, concepts of time, self-perception, stereotypes. The list could go on. What I mean is mental phenomena that are shared. And the thing is, in a sense, we are all interested in that. No? What are the tacit assumptions? What are the hidden norms? What are the narrative patterns that are in people's minds that they probably don't even know of, but that guide their action? Problem, mental dimension is unobservable. It's invisible. It's something like a hidden power. So this is something that we try to get at, to reconstruct by starting from that material dimension. So that's what we literary scholars do. The sociologists in the field might start from the social dimension. The psychologists in the field might think up methods in order to have a look at the mental dimension of memory culture. All right, so before I wrote that chapter on literature as a medium of cultural memory, I did in the early 2000s something like a survey, because we were interested in how does literary studies use the term memory these days? What kind of research is out there that would address memory? And we've identified a range of different fields, and I think some of them are still pretty much around today, and they give us probably a good sense of where people come from when they say they work on memory as literary theorists or historians. So the first I have called the memory of literature #1, namely literature as a symbolic system. How does literature remember itself, reenact, actualize former literary expressions? And that's just another word for a vast research on intertextuality, adaptation, remediation. You may name it, there are so many words outside about that. And for the German audience, the classical text for them would have been Renate Lachmann's The Memory of Literature, which is actually about Russian modernism. I'm not sure it was ever translated into Russian. It's in Germany, it came out in 1990, and she really calls her intertextual study The Memory of Literature. But there is a second variation of that genitive, because you can also look at how literature is itself remembered through that social dimension, which I have just mentioned. And that would mean looking at all those processes of canonization, institutionalization, dissemination, education. And this is something that the Assmanns, Jan and Aleida Assmann, that would again, for the German context, be important figures from the 1990s. That's something that they were very aware of and that they studied. So they asked the question, what do you need to keep a text like the Bible or Homer's epics, to keep them in circulation across so many centuries? And it's not just the quality of the text alone, it's so many things around that. So, and a third field of preoccupation with memory from a literary studies perspective is something that I call then literary mimesis of memory. And that would just be all those studies who are interested in how literary works can represent the memory process. No? That would be Marcel Proust. That would be Virginia Woolf. That would be David Copperfield. Many other and postmodern novels as well, that try to get again and again at how individual memory works, finding images for its associative working and so on. And of course, you can also look at novels that try to represent, to find versions of collective memory. And I think a lot of what in the 90s was called historiographic metafiction was really about that, exposing, showing how collective memory works. What are historians doing actually when they are writing their historiography? So I was basically socialized in my studies in the 90s with the British fictions that were so famous then, by Julian Barnes, for example, Flaubert's Parrot, or A History of the World in 10.5 chapters. And I think that would also be a kind of literary mimesis representation of collective memory. Now, the last part was something that I had not found research on, but it was something that I found most interesting at the time. And that is, how come that some people read one novel or two or three about, say, the First World War or the Holocaust, and this is what shapes their image in their minds about that historical event. So it's probably not so much what they heard in school, what they trained for their writings. It's probably not so much what they might read in historiography. It might even not be what their grandparents tell them, but it is that fictional representation in a novel, in a popular film, that kind of sticks in their minds, and that gives them a sense of what it was like, what this history was like. So as somebody trained in literary theory, of course, I was aware that that is, in a sense, a wrong way of reading, no? Because you don't conflate fictional versions of the past with the past itself. You don't do that. Literature, you know, is an act of the imagination. It is depragmatized. It has no easy referentiality. And still, people do it all the time. We do it all the time. And what are the mechanisms of that? And that is the fourth part, that I would call literature as a medium of collective memory. And in the end of the day, that also is a question that is connected with the field of reception and reception studies. And that has developed in many different ways in the 20 years that have passed since that first charting of the field. There is something like classical reception studies today, which looks at how antiquity lives on, but a little bit more, that's a number one question, because they are rarely interested in how individuals receive literary texts. So I think we have to look more for cognitive literary studies in order to find newer, thorough research on how it could be that imagined versions sometimes create images that are stronger than the versions that we find in non-fictional texts. And of course, we could go back to ancient aesthetics to find first hints at that. So that was basically the field that I found out there, to study how literature works within memory culture. That's basically the chapter that you've read, and I quickly have that here just as a summary and as a reminder. And I won't take long here. I just want to say one word about, or one sentence about each subchapter. Sentence number one, literature as a symbolic form of cultural memory. That's for me very important, because I am not a fan of the opposition of history versus memory, which says that history is the objective, the whatever, the real, and memory is the subjective, the thing that is connected to identities, and that is possibly also wrong. So I don't like the history-memory opposition, which is so widespread though. No? Also Pierre Nora, Maurice Halbwachs, many others using that. I think it's more productive to think about memory as a cover term. Memory is the way in which people make sense of past, present, and future, and they do so in social, cultural, material, whatever contexts. That's memory. And then in the second step, I think we might subdivide and see in what modes, or here I say in what symbolic systems, does that operation unfold? Is it in the symbolic system of myth or religion? That would be the oldest forms. Is it in the symbolic form of academic historiography? That is also for me one of the most reliable forms, which is guided by certain theories, by certain methods, by a certain way in which you arrange and what you do with your materials, with conventions. So very good. I love reliable historiography, but I see it as one way of human memory making. And there are other ways. And literature is another way. And that being my field, that's something that I try to figure out in that chapter. How does literature do it? And in the next two chapters, I basically say, perhaps not paradoxically, there are two things. Literature and memory, or narrative literature, that's what I tend to have in the back of my mind, and I'm sure we're going to come back to that because I'm a narratologist. Literature and memory have certain things seemingly in common. There are intersections, and I name condensation, narration, narrative patterns, and the importance of certain genres when you talk about the past, and that these genres already carry meaning. No? Imagine you tell the story of what happened to you yesterday as a tragedy or as a comedy. So there are these overlaps, the intersections. At the same time, there are differences between literature and other symbolic forms of doing memory. Literature is different from historiography, from religious myths, and so on and so forth in various ways. And that would now be literary theory. There are fictional privileges. Literature, there is interdiscursivity, think Bakhtin. Literature has a polyvalence, so it has many meanings at once. It's not a discourse that strives to have just one meaning. And it has that wonderful flip side of production, reflection of memory, often at the same time. In the next subchapter, I present a model which I call my mimesis of memory, and which is basically the fundament is taken from Paul Ricoeur's Time and Memory, where he says literary or narrative actually works in a threefold way. It's not just a representation of literature, of reality, but it is first prefigured, then it configures, and then it is being refigured. And I thought that that might be a good way of thinking about literature in memory culture as well. So this is the model. Oh, hang on, this was still animated. No, why not? So the model says that there's a literary text, and let's call it a mnemonic context. And on the mimesis one, that is Ricoeur's word, there's something like mnemonic prefiguration. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So each literary text never is created in a vacuum, but it is prefigured, preformed by existent texts, by existent discourses, by all the things that memory culture basically brings to us, makes available to us. And if it's even prefigured by language, in the sense that Bach would have spoken of the death of the author, no? That in a sense, to a degree, we are written, because these things are already around in memory or in culture broadly here. Mimesis number two, that would be the stuff that narratologists tend to be after. How are fictional narratives then configured? No? Selection, what events do you select? Configuration, combination, how do you put them into a syntagma? What perspectives do you bring in? How do you treat time? All these things are operations that you find at mimesis number two. And again, as a narratologist, we would say, and that's basically a group that worked 20 years ago around Ansgar Nünning in Gießen and Roy Sommer, who is now in Wuppertal. And they would have said, there is something like a functional potential in each narrative literary text. And I would say there is a mnemonic potential. So each text that deals with the past brings a potential for readerly actualization with it, depending on how it deals with the past. Does it present the past as a glorious myth? Does it present the past as a traumatic everyday experience, or something like a comedy that you can only laugh about? That's the mnemonic potential, and that's what you can put your finger on in the text. And sometimes you find it even in the narrative features of the text. All right, third step, again, in the Ricoeur spiral mode would be mimesis number three. And that's what he calls refiguration. and what I call, because I'm interested in collectivities, in the collective dimension, collective refiguration. So how would societies, communities take up this literary work? Would they read it? Would they discard it? Would they censor it? Would they forget it? Would they read it in this way and 20 years later in that way? And after the transcultural turn of 2010 around about, we would also ask, what happens when that literary text starts to travel and the collective refiguration does not take place in the country of origin, but on the other side of the globe? What do readers make of the text then? What kind of memories would they create then? And this would then tie in with the research, for example, by Alison Landsberg on prosthetic memory. Okay, so that is basically the model of the mimesis of memory as an ongoing spiral, because these texts that are now collectively refigured, that have made a change in the thinking, in the perceiving, in the meaning making, probably in the acting of a collectivity, that becomes part of their cultural memory, and that will feed again into the mimesis one, prefiguring new texts. So that's the idea of an ongoing spiral. What can we do as literary historians? If we take more a mimesis one, a prefiguration approach, we might want to put forth hypotheses about the mnemonic horizons and the challenges in a memory culture, trying to figure out what is it out there that is so important that is now prefigures that text. If we enter via the reception side, we could put forth hypotheses about how are these texts actualized? What effects do they have? What functions do they have in memory culture? And here again, I reiterate that among the main functions are two. Literature does produce memory. My example, working on the First World War as a PhD student, is people read All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. And after that, they had a sense of what the First World War, what the experience of the First World War was like. That's memory production. And literature always has that capacity of showing us, of exposing how memory, also collective memory works. And that is the potentially quite critical dimension of memory reflection. So that was the cycle of mimesis. Excuse me. And just 2 sentences on the rest of that chapter. A narratology of cultural memory tries to zoom in more on the mimesis 2 dimension. So how can literature create certain memory effects, or at least have that mnemonic potential? And I think there are certain narrative features that contribute more to an experiential mode. You read it and you feel basically it's immersive. You have a sense there's an eyewitness, or that even you become an eyewitness. There are other forms that make the whole stuff more mythical, monumental. You read it and you think, well, that's the big stories of my culture. It might be historicizing. That would be the historical novel of the late 19th century. It might be, the mode could be antagonistic. So it emphasizes how different groups are in competition with each other and who is the enemy of whom. And again, flip side, it might be a reflexive mode that exposes how memory works, and probably also that memory is always just a construct of a past that in its sheer messiness can never be grasped into one. It's always selections that we make. And the last chapter is more from a media theory standpoint. So what happens when we look at literary works as media? And in media theory, there is a tendency to distinguish between media, time-bound and space-bound media. The time-bound medium would here be the storage medium, the cultural texts. That's something that Aleida Assmann has put forth as a theory. that would be the great texts like the Bible, like certain epics, like national epics. They are cultural texts. And then if you look at literary texts through that lens, these are not things, these are just lenses. Through the cultural text lens, then you see how it comes that certain societies adopt certain books as their canonical books and others not. What I was more interested in is literature as a circulation medium. That's again the all quiet on the Western Front phenomenon, or whatever you might want to call it. Collective texts I call texts that are received by many, many people, even also popular literature. Just imagine that novel that appears today, everybody reads it, thinks he or she knows now exactly what, I don't know, 9/11 was about, and they may even forget it in 10 years' time, because the novel was never canonized, but it has shaped their mental images. And sometimes these collective texts can travel across time, and then they can yield literary afterlives. Literature as a media framework of memory goes back to what I said in the beginning, the cognitive dimensions of it. How does literature shape what we have in here and what are possible approaches? So that's the summary. Let me quickly see. I don't need to go, no, for the moment, I'm not going into anything else, but I'm more interested in what you will bring up. So thank you. I hope that I did, yes, I did end the presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Astrid, it was wonderfully rich, wonderfully concise, and we have plenty of ground to discuss. So I hope that everybody keeps their questions for some time, because we have at least 5 persons lined up with their extended questions. So may I first introduce these friends, and then they continue one by one. So Andrey Logutov, he teaching media studies, in fact, sound studies in Moscow, in our department at Moscow University. And then there's Ivan Delazari. Ivan?
Yes.
He was here. Yes, from St. Petersburg University, also working with texts that intersect and interact with music. We also have Victoria Malkina. Victoria, who is more into literature and theater. And we have Polina Rybina. Victoria Malkina, I'm sorry. So Ivan is from St. Petersburg University, and Victoria is from Russian State Humanities University, and Polina is from Moscow University again. Polina is doing adaptation studies, working in between literature and film. So shall we start? I suggest that we go in the order that I introduced everybody. Andrey?
Yeah, all right, thank you very much. I prepared well, I'm gonna be reading my presentation off the screen anyway, so I decided to share my screen. So it will be easier for the folk to be following whatever I'm gonna say. You see this?
Yes, fine.
Okay. And it says that it's gonna last 6 minutes, which I promise it will. So the title of my talk, I've tweaked it a little bit since I sent the last version to my colleagues, and now it's called Narrative Memory versus Textual Memory, Duality in the Mode of Engaging Cultural Material. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute to today's discussion. First, I'd like to say a few words about where I'm coming from with my inquiry. The main focus of my research is song lyrics, and therefore I feel compelled sometimes to take sides in debates around what lyric poetry is and what cognitive mechanisms it brings into play. Some of the current debate evolves around the question of lyrics fictionality, whether it may be construed as representing a fictional situation centered around a fictional persona, or alternatively, as an utterance containing statements about the real world. This debate can be, and oftentimes is, framed in terms of relations between text and memory. If lyrics are fundamentally fictional, then the reader will be inclined to remember their narrative and situational content. Emotions will have to be categorized under situational. If, however, lyrics are not fictional and function as reality statements, then the reader will be encouraged to remember them literally, word for word. The two mechanisms are, of course, not incompatible. Walter Kendall, in his 2011 paper, refers to poetry as a form of thought writing. Similarly to how speechwriters produce discourses for public speakers to perform, poems provide ideas for readers to think. Within this perspective, lyrics are utterances that seek to be internalized by the reader to establish themselves in her mind and her memory as her own, and to be repeatedly performed by her on occasions that will set them into situational contexts. Lyrics are therefore remembered not for the events represented in them, but as speech events, akin to slogans, aphorisms, and pop songs. An interesting quality of such speech events is that we don't really have to understand their meaning. We may remember a phrase in a language we don't know. Also, they may contain very little detail from the time, culture, and circumstance in which they were conceived. And yet, they establish an overarching connection between personal experiences of the past and those of the present, thus opening up a historical perspective. Pop songs are remembered because they're repeated. The repetitions within themselves, to wit, choruses and refrains, they are listened on repeat using personalized sound reproduction devices such as mobile phones. Some of them, including anthems and hymns, are routinely rehearsed and reperformed across ritualistic contexts. Some, like jingles, are so pervasive that they just worm into your ear, no matter what ideas you have about self-control or the powers of good taste. All of this share a set of common features, which I'd like to lay out briefly using the example of a well-known protest song titled "We Shall Overcome." Well, first, it has a very unclear pedigree. It bears resemblance to a number of songs originating from mid-19th to mid-20th century. This first printed version that appeared in 1947, affixed to the name of Pete Seeger, was surely predated by a number of oral variants. Second, it's hard to map across genres and traditions. It's traceable back to Black labor songs, gospel, working class white music, etc. Third, it is variable in its lyrical content, with the only stable and immediately identifiable element being the eponymous refrain, plus a few more words. Point 4, it has been performed so many times in such a broad variety of contexts that semantically it functions more as a reference than a message. Typically, it's understood to allude to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and has a particular association with Martin Luther King Jr. However, it has been used by national liberation movements in the context of human rights activism as a symbol of national unity, etc. Therefore, 5, the reference of the subject pronoun we, which is central to the text, is redefined in every performance. In colorist terminology, the song functions as an, and I have trouble pronouncing this, but anyway, epideictic utterance. That is a statement about the world in the moment of its production. But being statements about the present, epideictic utterances are not carriers of memory. I'm enjoying this round table is an epideictic utterance, and it says very little about my past or my memory thereof. Where does memory enter the picture then, if at all? Is it a narrative memory of when and why the song was performed in the past that is external to the song itself? Is it the universality of the message that transcends time and thus makes itself feel like a memory because memory also transcends time? Is it the ritualistic way that lyrics are passed from one person to another? Is it their effective content that evokes memories in performance and listeners, albeit different memories? All of these questions have to do with how these two modes of memory, well, the opposition between which ought not to be taken too seriously, as it was born in a heated argument about obscure lyrical matters, operate in different literary genres and as applied to historical past. How is remembering words balanced against remembering events? Does the former connect us more intimately to what we remember? Does it make the memory our own in the way that lyrics become owned by the reader's mind? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrey. So while this thinks, may I invite Ivan to offer a question of his own?
Hi, thank you. I wonder if you can see my PowerPoint at this moment.
Yes.
Is it visible? All right, and I hope that the slides are going to go one after the other. All right, so my talk today, first of all, thanks very much for this fascinating opportunity and the experience of reading Astrid's chapter and listening to her talk, which basically kind of lets me know that even though I can't pretend that I'm a memory studies person, but in a way we all are. So my talk is going to be about a question that is basically similar to Andrey's. So I'm interested in the problem of fictionality in a sense, but what I find primarily interesting about Astrid's writing is the relationship between cultural or collective memory on the one hand and something that we would associate with individual memory or memories on the other. And so there is a certain circularity involved here because you can say that cultural memory cannot do without individual memories of those people who are members of the culture. But on the other hand, individual memories, as Astrid shows quite convincingly, cannot do without all those traces of cultural memories, post-memory, etc. Right? So there is a kind of chicken and egg dilemma involved here, which I'm mostly interested in. And if we think about the type of text that Astrid in her chapter calls cultural texts, those canonized works that kind of represent an imagined communities, beliefs and memories from the past, including historical past, such as in the Russian literature, War and Peace, which is still taught at secondary schools, right? The opposite example, if you allow these primitive binaries, is the one that Astrid has given herself in her talk, the Marcel Proust great novel. And if we think about these two examples of those canonical works, right, Tolstoy's work might be more associated with cultural or collective memory for the simple reason that the ideology of history, so to say, in that novel is all about how individuality doesn't matter, how history is not made by individuals, whether that's Napoleon or Kutuzov, but rather by that cudgel or club of people's war, Dubina Narodной Войны, right? That this, and that is something that really matters in the past and in the collective consciousness of a culture. Proust's novel, on the other hand, is more associated, or probably exclusively associated with individual memories. So such trivia of everyday life as Madeleine or a sonata played by a violinist, right? So this binary opposition that some of the texts in literature may be more indoctrinating because they are more appropriated by the system of education and politicians and cultural institutions. And so it is basically very little that individual readers might remember of the Tolstoy novel. My favorite joke, of course, is Woody Allen's summary of the Tolstoy novel. It's about some Russian, right? So the work itself is heavily reduced to some memes, right? And the pictures in my slide basically show that, right? So there is this oak tree, for example, that Andrey Bolkonsky is engaged with somehow, and it symbolizes something, and it sticks in readers' memories, etc. The Proustian way, I would say, which basically manages, as we remember, to basically oversleep the First World War, right? Because it doesn't really happen despite the fact that the novel is set during that war. The Proustian way might be kind of promoted by Hayden White's late rethinking, or rather development, of his early metahistorical thought in the book called The Practical Past, where White suggests that historiography has one kind of past, historiographical or historical past, and it depends on the documents. But so much is left out for it is undocumented. And literature, according to White, is particularly the vehicle for the practical past, those undocumented memories, such as real ordinary people's feelings and experiences. Literature is exactly the vehicle for it to be reproduced and made available, and then memorized anew by those who read those novels, right? So it's a kind of a way to save memories associated with practical past from oblivion. Literature is the medium for that. And finally, and I'm getting closer to my main question here, right? If you think about the way readers experience literary narratives, right? How the embodied reader, so to say, right, enacts whatever happens in the story world to some characters by projecting part of ourselves into the fictional reality, vying with some story world possible selves via blending, etc. So those mechanisms are definitely involved in any act of reading, but is it really every act of reading? Or is it only an act of close reading? In her chapter, Astrid mentions the situation at which, to actually remember the cultural information contained in a classic such as War and Peace, people don't even need to read it, okay? So there are school kids, for instance, who have never read the Tolstoy novel, the 4 volumes of that, or the 7 volumes of the Proust, but still they have the idea, right, of what those works are about. So my question is about the distance of reading. I don't want to talk about distant reading now, but it's something that I would call non-reading, right? We can fail to have read the book, and yet it is part of memory loop, so to say. And the final slide here is taken from Manfred Jan's 2003 article that basically argues something very similar to what Astrid was talking about, that every act of memory is circular, right? It's always a circle. What I want us to ask ourselves about now is if what this module has to say about this non-reading experience. So let's say there is a work of literature I read it closely, I internalize, there is an internal story made out of it in my mind. Then I decide to externalize it, according to Jan, right? So I basically summarize the Tolstoy novel to a friend who is my classmate, okay? This is a very reduced and abridged, absurdly brief summary. And yet this person internalizes that version of the Tolstoy, and then it functions in culture like that, okay? So my big question then is whether we can say that cultural memory is this kind of reduced version of the riches that individual memory and the experience of close reading can grant us with. And whether and what then can we do about this problem? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivan. And thank you for this wonderful phrase, which we can all repeat again and again. I can't pretend, you said, to be a memory studies person, but in a way we all are. Very, very true. So Victoria, one more such person, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for this very interesting event. I have no presentation, but I have a text fragment, so it will be in chat now. And my current research interest is literature as a medium of historical memory. And so the concept I would like to talk about is a concept of collective texts. According to Astrid, the collective text is a mechanism of reception involving a certain way of reading. When a literary text is read not only and not so much as fiction, but as a sort of source of knowledge about the past, about the historical events. And thus the image of a certain era is created and reinforced in the reader's mind through the prism of this or that. This happens because, unlike a traditional history textbook, a work of fiction does not simply list facts, but draws the world of the era symbolically and figuratively, appealing not only to the mind, but also to the emotions and imagination of the reader. Of course, the reader understands that the world of a literary work is a fictional world. But at the same time, reading the text, we as if conclude a contract with the author, believing in the credibility of everything that happens in this world. Umberto Eco wrote about this in detail in the last chapter of the Book of Legendary Lands. On the other hand, if we perceive a work as purely documentary, such as an autobiography, for example, we believe, or we want to believe, in the veracity of the events described already in our real world. And I think that the most interesting thing begins when these two types of texts are combined. That is, when the story is based on real historical events and are woven into the fiction. That is, the work is no longer pure fictional, but it is not a documentary chronic either. And the reader has a question, how to perceive it, to believe it or not. Is it history or literature, memory or imagination, and so on. From my point of view, the concept of collective text can be very productive in these contexts, since it actualizes both sides of literature, the fictional and the referential. Well known that since the works of Maurice Halifax, memory studies has often separated history and memory. History begins when vivid memory ends, and I also don't like it, but it's a fact. However, I like that Marian Hirsch has introduced the concept of post-memory. Post-memory is also a receptive mechanism, a kind of appropriation of others' memories. She wrote that post-memory is a structure of inter- and transgenerational transmission of traumatic knowledge and experience of those who came before, experiences that they remember only by means and the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. In relating the two receptive mechanisms, collective text and post-memory, the question arises as to whether their interaction is possible, and if so, how can they influence each other? And it seems interesting for me to see one example. It is a play by the American writer Barbara Lebow, Shayne Maidel, written in 1984. The play and the productions are quite popular in the US till now, so I think we can see how the mechanisms of collective text and post-memory can meet. Most scholars consider Barbara Lebow's play to be an example of Holocaust drama, but the Holocaust is not portrayed in the play at all. What we have is its effect, the trauma caused by it. It is a play not so much about the Holocaust, but about the memory of the Holocaust, and therefore seems interesting in the context of our conversation today. The play focuses on two sisters and their father. Rysel and Lucia Weiss were born in a Jewish family in Poland. In late 20s, Mordechai, the father, with the younger daughter, Rysel, went to the United States, and the elder daughter, Lucia, with her mother, stayed in Poland. She married, she had a daughter, but in the early years of the war, her husband was arrested, and she and her mother and her daughter were brought to Auschwitz, where her daughter and her mother were perished. Lucia ends up in the States after surviving Auschwitz, where her father manages to find her. The action in the play takes place in 1946 in the Rose's New York apartment. The whole play is the sisters' attempt to find some common ground, which in the end they managed to do. The main conflict of the play is based on the family's fragmented nature, on their inability to understand each other, since they have different lifestyles and experience and have no common memories. One of the most important scenes in the play, that is in the fragment in chat, is when Mordechai and Lucia take turns reading from their lists of family members. Mordechai has nothing but names since he had been separated from the Polish branch of his family, but Lucia knows everything, and he knows about everybody that when and where they were perished. Lucia and Mordechai are the keepers of the family's memories. But Rose does not have those memories. She does not know the names either, and she does not really know what happened to her mother and knows little about Holocaust. Thus, we have several images of the Holocaust. Lucia is a survivor. Mordechai knows a lot about it from stories and readings. Rosa knows practically nothing. The family reunion at the end is essentially a recreation of their shared family and historical memory. On the other hand, the reader and the spectator is required to have a historical memory from the outset. Thus, in the already mentioned scene, it is a map of extermination camps is spread out before our eyes. However, if we want it to happen, the reader has to be familiar with the locations and dates mentioned. A description of the Holocaust is created here, but not by means of numbers, but by the image. Barbara Lebow shows a large Jewish family, most of whom perished, and of whom not much more than memory is left. In a quite recent interview, Barbara Lebow says that this play is not about her family. They have not experienced the Holocaust. She herself is from the next generation, and the play is written for the next generations. In the Israel's theater Yiddish Spiel announcement, the play is described as aimed towards those who was born after the Holocaust, but who feel the shadow of it as their identity. That is exactly what, according to Marian Hirsch, post-memory is, when we feel the previous generation's traumatic experience as our own. But at the same time, it seems that we can speak of a collective text because by interacting with all the other works about Holocaust that we have read, it creates an emotional symbolic image of historical events is in our minds and thereby creates another level of historical memory. However, the question of the different ways in which the collective text and post-memory interact still remains. Thank you for your attention. Звук, Татьяна Дмитриевна.
Sorry, thank you very much. And now, Polina, please.
Right, I'll share my screen. Okay, so that's the topic, condensation, recondensed memory regimes in film adaptations. In a contemporary media environment, literature, or more precisely, the literary narrative, exists in various extended forms, film adaptation being one of them. Adaptations are, in a sense, multi-layered vehicles for memories of the literary or other originals. When readers become viewers or vice versa, or viewers become gamers and so on, they enter the territory of condensation of many ideas, images, feelings linked to specific narrative worlds. We read on, we read on condensation in Astrid Erll's book, Memory and Culture, where it is called arguably the main characteristic of literature. A shift from literature to its screen double, film adaptation, allows for continuing with a question. What is a filmic condensation of an already condensed literary memory? Elaborating on this aspect helps us understand our need for revisitation of narratives in different media forms. So this paper focuses on two metaphors of a palimpsest and a network, which help comprehend the ways viewers of film adaptations process familiar narratives in new formats. These metaphors exist explicitly and implicitly in contemporary adaptation studies and are linked to both individual memory and collective memory levels, but schematically, each metaphor is better suited for a particular level. The metaphor of a palimpsest for the individual organic memory and the metaphor of a network for the collective. The palimpsest regime is particularly relevant when the viewer is acquainted with the narrative in some other medium form, have read the novel before watching the film, have seen many actors in the same role. This kind of engagement presupposes that we are intrigued by actively holding several texts in our minds and are preoccupied with some comparative juxtaposition of them. We are preoccupied with seen before, read before, half remembered, half forgotten, half recollected. The palimpsest regime is welcome when we think of narratives which have a limited, accessible for non-artificial intelligence number of different media versions. Having recently rewatched David Lynch's Dune, not the director's cut, but still it took 3 hours of my lifetime. So having done that, I have purposefully consciously arranged my palimpsestous engagement with Denis Villeneuve's Dune. So my ability to see through the character of Timothée Chalamet and respond to his difference from Paul Atreides, played by Kyle MacLachlan, or to enjoy the transformation of Nordic Max von Sydow character into the Black woman warrior played by Sharon Duncan Brewster, or to lament the degradation of Fade, you remember, played by Sting in Lynch's version, and there is no compensation for this loss in Villeneuve's film. So in an attempt to construct for myself a more complicated kind of experience, I even started rereading Frank Herbert's book, One of this saga. To wind up, this first type of memory regime presupposes the viewer's recondensation of the already condensed. Aware of the dependence of individual memory on social structures, I still want to emphasize the usefulness of the palimpsest metaphor for this type of data processing. Another type of engagement might be called a network memory regime. This is the previous slide, but now you concentrate on its right side. It's applicable for narratives that are archetypal, span hundreds of years, and are inaccessible for a standard non-artificial intelligence to process. They are realized in the realm of collective memory. The vampire, Dracula, Nosferatu stories, here's a small image borrowed from a colleague, have existed for centuries and do exist in the contemporary cultural landscape in multiple media formats, which I would not dare to delayer to unpack. It's a huge mega cultural archive. And adaptations here serve as tools of prosthetic memory, which help the audience cope with hardly ever seen, hardly ever read, hardly ever recollected. The metaphor of a network accentuates not how much is remembered, but how culturally productive certain nodes in the network are, how effectively information flows along certain network channels. On the slide is my current case study, a network schematically revealing several interrelations which exist between various versions of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Being an adaptation, like many Shakespearean plays, of a pre-existing novella of Matteo Bandella's adaptation of Luigi da Porta's adaptation and so on, Shakespeare's play acquired a new life on the 20th century screen. And you see different channels of this network are in different colors. So I'm ready to speak about 3 lines of the story development, but I'll focus on one, which is in green. This is an influential line of a West Side story kind. A radical change of context with the emphasis on complex social conflicts in the background of a love story. So it's either opposition of migrant gangs like in Abel Ferrara's China Girl. This is the upper image with the corpses in blood. Or mafia clans opposition like in Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet. To make all that more complex and political, The Lovers of Verona of Andrey Kayat is set in post-war Italy, making Juliet a daughter of a fascist magistrate. Irgi Weiss's Romeo, Juliet in Darkness transformed the girl into a young Jewish woman to be hidden from Gestapo in 1942 by a Prague student. Peter Ustinov's Romanov and Juliet reminds us of Cold War contexts. And Timur Bekmambetev's Screen Life movie R#J make us think of different ways, conflicting ways to use social media. When Harold Bloom writes about this tragedy in his book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, he twice uses the word remember. The first quotation, when I think of this play, I first remember neither this nor that, but my mind goes directly to the vital center, Act 2, Scene 2, with its incandescent exchange between the lovers. And the second quotation is even better. Perhaps any playgoer or any reader remembers best Romeo and Juliet obeyed after their single night of fulfillment. Though we do not know what any playgoer or any reader remembers, it is pointless to argue that this tragedy is associated in the cultural memory with, quote, persuasive celebration of romantic love, unquote, Bloom. That almost any story of the tragic obstacles to young love triggers unavoidable comparisons with Romeo and Juliet. But, as Tony Howard pointed out in his article, Shakespeare's Cinematic Offshoots, we inherit from this play not only our images of romance and generational discord, but also images of social hatred. This I tried to demonstrate. Appropriating the tragedy, the international screen successfully repurposes it to produce our memories of diverse social contexts and to look into different types, varieties, variations, and degrees of violence and social hatred produced by these contexts. So Family Void is repurposed to create flows of cultural information to remind us of political and social instability, ethnical and racial confrontation, war memories, corporate wars, media corporation wars, and so on. Adaptation is about the change of context. But what I'm driving at, unpredictably, this story turned out to be very productive on the screen of violence, shifting to the background, the romantic part of the story, significantly shifting our cultural attention. So the network, taking us away from the memory of the literary originals, works as an area of prostatic historical memory. And the image on the screen is from last year's film, Die in a Gunfight, and it's a good visual metaphor for romance staying in the background and violence foregrounded. You see a gun in the cinema theater. So the question is, I would say, but the question is, in this time of so many distractions, are we really eager to profit fully by prosthetic memories of unknown contexts offered to us by adaptations? Can we immerse, stay engaged with complex ways of extending the literary? Or we average viewers would prefer to think of network nodes as yet another version of the literary original, as an easier and safer way to take a memory journey back to Shakespeare, and not to take contingent memory trips into the unpredictable social contexts that we know so little about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Panina. Certainly there's plenty of tasty bits to chew and plenty of ground to cover even now. I'd like to add at this point one very light note, and this is it. The question is whether memory is a condition of creativity, or its opposite, or its reverse. And there's no answer, since the two processes seem interrelated. You create as you reminisce, while the process of creation feels very much like reminiscence. It's a striving to come closer and closer and yet closer to something that emerges as you do. One may try to play back the stages of the creative process, much like Edgar Allan Poe does, or boasts he does, in The Philosophy of Composition, in relation to his own poem, The Raven. And whether it's a genuine reconstruction, reminiscence, or a hoax, we'll never know. But interestingly, even this brilliant demonstration of the power to remember what no poet, or almost no poet, can remember, starts with dismissing the crucial starting point. Or as Poe puts it, the circumstance, or rather the necessity, that first gave rise to the intention of composing a poem. Poe overstates the uniqueness of his effort, I think. One could easily make a no small collection of attempts by various poets to reach back to this beginning of the creative venture, which tends to be some experience pre-linguistic yet distinctly aesthetic, necessitating an effort at creative expression or search for one. And it could be a list comprising, I don't know, Blake and Wordsworth and Whitman and Dickinson and Akhmatova and Rilke. The big question, which I'm asking myself, is what to do with these riches that we might, as I say, easily collect. And by way of an example, let me give you a poem that any Russian somehow it doesn't come up. Any Russian knows by heart. Okay, it disappeared from my screen. I'm sorry, so you'll have to, every Russian will remember, and Astrid will have to take it on ear. It's a poem by Osip Mandelstam, and I'll read it in translation to make it sounds strange to most people present, to invite to think about memory and creativity on one hand, and also to, sorry to say, prod Astrid to tell us more about her current Odysseus travel project, because the poem is about that. And this here is the poem in the best translation, English translation I found. Insomnia, Homer, the rows of stretched sails. I've read the catalogue of ships just to the middle, that endless caravan, that lengthy stream of cranes, which long ago rose up above the land of Hellas. It's like a wedge of cranes towards the distant shores, the foreheads of the kings crowned with the foam of gods. Where are you sailing to? If Helen were not there, what Troy would be to you, O warriors of Achaia? The sea and Homer, everything is moved by love. It sounds to a Russian ear like beauty is truth, true beauty. Whom shall I listen to? There's no sound from Homer, and full of eloquence, the Black Sea roars and roars and roars with thunderous crashing near to my pillow, written in Crimea in 1915. Rereading Iliad to find insomnia leaves one in a curiously indeterminate space, suspended space between past and present, sleep and wakefulness, dullness of sleep and unconscious activity of dream. And interestingly, it's at midpoint of the catalogue of ships that there's a starting point, which feels like a sudden sinking of falling back through time, or remembering the moment before 9 years hopeless siege of Troy, when those same ships started from Boeotia. And interestingly, again, it's here that movement starts, the intense generation of forms, the wedge of flying cranes resembling the formation of ships at full sail, that resembling a crest of a running sea wave, that resembling a sound of a hexameter line. So rereading of an ancient, well-remembered poem translates into the creation of a new poem, an activity that a reader is involved in with curious directness. And since it is an activity, issues of intention and attention inevitably come up, signaled by two questions. And I'm sorry I do not have the text in front of us, but you'll remember that the two questions run parallel. And these are rhetorical questions since they seem to need no answer. Where are you going to? To which goal? Of course, the Achaean warriors are sailing to Troy after gold and vengeance. Ironically, though, they do not seem to know that it's Helen beauty rather than the war booty that moves them. And then there comes, whom shall I listen to? Of course, I, the lyrical subject, listens to the voice of the bard. Ironically, though, the word more or sea sounds through the name Homer, Gomer, and what begins to matter to the listener, whether in the text or outside the text, is the rhythm of the, to use Whitman's words, cradle endlessly rocking, rather than the events related, described in the epic narrative. The sea may be other than the one sailed by the Odysseus ships, yet somehow the same. Moreover, it is right here by the bedside and right now. And whether this feels like a material dimension or a mental dimension, to refer to Astrid's slide shown a few minutes before, is very hard to say. So the question coming from this example, the big question to me, does philology have instruments to describe, to discuss, and to analyze this eloquence before locution, without content, explicit content, but definitely generating poetic expression? Or should we never even raise this issue seriously, but plainly readdress it to some newfangled neuroaesthetics lab? Even so, I suspect it's likely that after much intricate experimentation and measurements, the problem will fall back into our hands. So may it not provide for a new collaboration between memory studies and literary studies? And could not this collaboration lend new perspective on human creativity on one hand and literature on the other, except they seem to be the same? So this is my question into the heap of questions. And I suggest that at this point we make a short break. And since these questions are heaped, well, on all of us together collectively, but also on Astrid, could we invite Astrid to comment on our questioning?
Should I?
Yeah, if you please.
Okay. So first of all, thank you. That was just fantastic. And it was absolutely rich and thought-provoking. And this is some of what I wrote down. So of course, I cannot find my way, and I would take too long if I addressed each now. Let me move backwards. And let me probably start with the invitation that Tatiana gave me to talk about Homer, because many of your examples kind of touch on that, also because there are similar cases. I also have a adaptation network palimpsest case, for example, like the Romeo and Juliet case. And I wish I was already at a stage where I could draw these elaborate maps, no? What moves to what seems to be influenced or takes up certain parts from what. That would be the one big field that we touch here and that I think is central for memory studies, and that is literary mnemohistory. I think this is really a term, it was coined by Jan Assmann, but I think we should reintroduce it, give it more emphasis, literary mnemohistories. And that would mean more than histories of influence, because there is all the messiness and the dynamics that we heard about, and then there is the individual, the mental side that I agree we should not leave to cognitive scientists at all, but we might team up with them for some things. And probably this teaming up, I start with that. I'd like to think through your comments and projects with the first pair of terms, and I would like to call them gist versus potentiality. Gist is the kind of memory that we retain from narratives. And that's what I learned in a wonderful book written by Andrew Elfenbein. I put that in the chat, the gist of reading. So that's a cognitive science, cognitive studies, very well founded, very well written. Also somebody who's aware of the problems that we have when we translate cognitive psychology approaches into literary history approaches. And he basically finds also in his own experiments that what we retain is a gist. And I think this is a lot of what I've heard so far. We just retain the gist of Tolstoy, and probably that gist was just given to us in a remediated form by somebody who told it to us orally, and we move on. And if we are a great creative artist, we make a fantastic new poem out of that, just out of that gist that we heard. So that is something that was my experience with the Homer project. This is about the remediations of the Odyssey across time. It's not, it's a word that I learned late in my Anglistics. The gist. The gist means a very abstracted sense of, yes, the essence. Thank you, Andrey. It's just the essence of something. the gist of War and Peace is, I don't know, there were Russians, there was war, there was peace. The gist of the Odyssey, I'm better at that, is somebody traveling around, wife waiting, many adventures, come home. That's the gist of the Odyssey. That means even the closest readers, those who really are academically trained, who have a lot of time, pay attention to detail, ask them 5 years later, and they will probably just produce the gist. So that's the one hand. What is literary memory if that kind of narrative gist is all we retain? And that's probably also what is passed on. That's the one question. But I think there's a complementary characteristic of literature, and that is what has recently been discussed using words like potentiality, because we have the written text. We have, for Homer, all those thousands of lines. We also retain the original Shakespeare. And that's the logic of our literate culture. Aleida Assmann would say we retain these texts in our storage memory, in our archive. And that is whoever does want to move away from the gist. And the gist is, of course, getting more and more normative, ideological, unthinking, and so on and so forth. If you want to move back, you consider the sources again. And in the sources, you find potential that were probably not actualized in 3,000 years, as in the Odyssey. And that's the fascinating thing about literary history. And that's also where the power of literature stems from. You revisit and you find things that speak to your present moment in things that no generation before has thought it might. And just to give one recent example of the Odyssey and the Iliad, I just read Pat Barker's reworking popular historical novels of the Iliad. Can't remember, there are so many of them now, women's reworkings of the Iliad. And she makes the point, it was a rape camp. And of course, the point was there before, but she makes it so strong that you think it takes 3,000 years, and then somebody can come and make this so clear and so strong what that old poem means and may mean about war in patriarchal societies. So that was the one pair of terms that I wanted to talk about. And perhaps I stop here for a moment because I don't want to make monologues, and I may find now more intellect in my sources here, in my writings.
Great. So I'm sure there are more questions up people's sleeves. I mean, everybody not sitting here. Well, everybody's sitting, but in front of their screens. So shall we invite?
Or may I say one more? And
yes,
meanwhile, everybody else wonders what they might want to say. One more thing, one more pair of terms, and that would be backward-facing remembering in a stronger sense, even probably commemorative, versus forward-facing enabling of new expressions through literature. And I think that's a lot of what is behind the examples we've seen so far. Ne? Osip Mandelstam creates that new poem. And I think there is a quote by him where he says, we have so many English rare pre-sentiments. And that reminds me of prefiguration, pre-sentiments. So the archive is also there in order to propel literature forward and into the future and to enable new stuff. And I think that's important because many people say, these memory studies scholars, they are always only concerned with the past and how the past is represented. It's part of it, but it's not everything. There's also that future dimension.
Thank you so much for this idea, because I've been debating with myself about what literary studies today is or might be, and whether it's not turning into some purely archival science or kind of scholarship. But then, as you're saying, that archive is there not just to be kept behind whatever, closed doors, windows, closed everything, but to propel literature in the future, to make us ask about the best ways to do the propelling, it becomes totally different and quite optimistic. Artyom Zubov, could you now take over from me and see if there are questions?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to all the presenters for their wonderful and very interesting talks. We actually have one question in chat. It's from Anna Schwetz. Also, I can say that anyone who has any questions, you can raise your hand using Zoom interface, whatever you can call it. Yes, and also I have a question that I wanted to ask from the very beginning. So that's a question to Astrid and also to Ivan Delazari and also to Tatiana Venediktova, and maybe also to Polina Rybin and Andrey. I was very intrigued by what Ivan said about distance of reading and the practices of non-reading. And then when Tatiana Venediktova said about this opposition between memory and creativity. And I was thinking that I think in very general sense, my question would be, how do literary texts exist in history, and how do readers from different historical periods can read those texts? So it seems to me that one of the specific features of literary texts is that they can exist in very different historical periods. That now in the 21st century, we can read texts from the 19th century, 18th century, and even more ancient times. And it's apparently we do not read those texts the way, we read them differently from the way they were read when they were produced. And so what do? It seems that we adapt those texts to ourselves. We make those texts different in a way that they can be understood by us. And it seems that, how do we do that? One of the answers, I guess, is that we do that by literary genres. So we use literary genres to adapt texts from different historical periods to ourselves. So I guess my question is that, can we say that in order to a literary text exist in history and to be read by people in different historical periods, literary texts have to, forget something. They have to, relieve from this burden of memory of form, memory of representation, or memory of whatever. So literature also has to forget in order to exist in history. So that is my question. And I would be very grateful if Tatiana or Astrid or Andrey or Polina would say something to that. Because Polina Rybin was also saying about different practices of adaptation, which I guess is also a way how we read texts differently, and thus we make sure that those texts exist in our memory, but they exist differently from the way they existed in the context of production. So yes, I would be very grateful.
Anybody. Anyway, my first reaction is that the answer is contained in the question, because of course it is a very complex balance of remembering and forgetting. And it's interesting, I would love to hear more from Astrid about this metaphor of memory as travel, because I do not know if we can speak at all about the art of traveling, whether there is such art. But I think there is, because traveling is not just movement in space, but as you get from one place to another, you adapt to the nature of a new place. And it takes a truly creative effort. That's my first reaction.
Yeah, and if I could just enter here for just a moment, Artyom, thank you for the question. It reminds me of the river, which you cannot enter twice. But actually you cannot even enter it once. You say some things are made different by the time, and Astrid specifies that it's not only about the past that memory studies deal with, right? It's also about present and future, for the simple reason that, as Tatiana has just mentioned, it's motion, it's travel. there is nothing that is ever the same, right? Everything is different. Everything is forgotten and remembered. That's natural. That's normal. It's not a vicious circle. It's a good kind of circle.
Yes, yes, and that's what you said about this distance of reading. There has to be some distance in order sorry, I'm losing my English. In order so we can read text, and so actually every act of reading is also a non-reading. It's always yeah.
And I'd like to make a short comment about when we think about this binary moving forward or moving backward, remembering or forgetting. I think in my talk, I tried to speak about not moving in this or that direction, but getting off the track. So getting sidetracked. This is what adaptation does when adaptation makes us think about, well, unpredictable contexts. And you are not really made to forget something. And nobody insists that you have remember something that you are unable to remember because contexts change and you have no knowledge of them, but you are made to get off the track. And this is, I think, a way to destabilize this binary between forgetting and remembering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a note in chat that rhymes with what Polina was saying, and Yulia Bikozarova reminds us that it's probably more fruitful to think not in terms of opposites, like memory opposite history or memory opposite creativity, but rather to use this as and something kind of like some other thing or related to that other thing. Yeah, thank you, Yulia.
Yeah, or creativity, I see it in the chat, as and memory. The end always implies a bit of an equation, and that's it, but perhaps creativity as enabled by memory, in memory as the by creativity, absolutely, yes, I would agree. Just three things, really interesting, everything, about what Artem said. I think you also referred to the process of remediation, and that means adaptation of memorata, memory contents, across time to keep those memories alive. They tend to be remediated again and again across the spectrum of available media technologies. So a strong side of memory, and I think you can make that point for the Shakespeare plays as well as for the Anne Frank diaries or whatever. As soon as somebody has invented film, it will be put into film. As soon as there's digital storytelling, it will be put into digital storytelling. So that's the dynamics of remediation in memory culture. Forget in order to exist, yes. I mean, is it Moretti who said there's the slaughterhouse of literary history? It's a slaughterhouse. So 99% is forgotten anyway. And in order for us to exist, because we would be completely overwhelmed with anything else. From the particular case, I find it interesting. The Odyssey needed to be culturally forgotten so that Dante could create something that was extremely interesting and generative and new and sparked a whole new literature, but he didn't know anything about the Homeric Odyssey because it was kind of lost in the Middle Ages. So there you have something like a productive forgetting. And you could also argue that Ezra Pound was so good because he didn't know enough of ancient Greek, or some people have made that argument. And then there are literary engagements like James Joyce's Ulysses that thrives on knowing a lot, on not forgetting. And it depends, I think, yeah, if I find these cases, you find these cases. Memory as travel, lastly, yes. Travel across time, often with the vehicle of remediation, adaptations into new media. Also travel across space. And then the question is, what travels? Is it the story patterns that travel? Is it the generic forms that travel? We haven't even started to talk about that first, Andrey's thing, no? That was also about the question of, if we look at the lyrical, it's not the narrative gist that we are interested in. This is where certain collocations travel. certain verses may travel. And that, of course, I find in Homer as well, where people can recite back to me the first 10 lines even today, and it's going on. So yeah, stopping here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we have also a question from Snezhana Aleynikova, I guess. So Snezhana, please.
Thanks. I don't have a presentation, but I will share my screen. Here it is. So my interest is in the relationship between memory and narration. Commenting what Astrid Erll write, it isn't enough to pick up isolated data of our past experience. Indeed, it isn't. We organize the data narratively with the view of the goal we pursue and the effect we wish to produce upon the listener or reader. All this is very relevant to the text I'm working with currently, which is Eugenio Montale's novel, Butterfly of Dinard. The novel gives us a great example of how memory works. Each story is a recollection. From Aleida Essman, we know it can be passive when the trigger is a thing or a smell, and it can be active when the narrator recollects self-consciously. Now I'm trying to find a connection between these types of memories and narration in the novel. Most of the stories began right away, but in some there is a short introduction. For example, there would be a one-paragraph description of a town or a church, and only then the narrator would tell us, one summer evening, I was there. The order of the stories also is an interesting problem. In the first part of the book, there are many different characters, and the stories can be easily organized in pairs, because stories with the same character go one after another. Gradually, we move towards a broader picture and greater polyphony. Montale uses pen names, so in fact, many characters is hidden him. In two last parts, there is narration from the first-person view. Every story in the first part ends with a short interpretation of some past event, and every story in the last part ends with a question about life. So each recollection is multiply reflected. The distinction between individual memory and collective memory, both the narrators and the readers, is yet another issue. No historical event like war is described directly. Instead, there are many geographic details, names of streets, mentions of musical pieces or foods that all act as leitmotifs. The fragmentariness of the text evokes the fragmentariness of our memory. Obviously, the author desires to connect with us, readers, to share his memory and call upon our collective memory. But the genre of a diary confession he finds unfitting. He rather needs fiction providing for the effects of complex polyphony. So I think one chapter or one story is conceived on plot level and the whole novel on structure level. But speaking of plot, how can we distinguish autobiographical elements from fiction? Could you give an advice of some good examples of analytical work on memory in autobiographical fiction? Thanks, that was my question.
Obviously addressed to you, Astrid.
All right, thank you so much. There was so much in there. I don't know the novel, but I have a feeling that with what you mentioned, the polyphony, the multi-perspectivity, the way it's structurally made, and the way it shows the fragmentariness of memory, that could really be a novel that exemplifies that reflexive mode of a depiction of how collective memory works, and what its perspectives are, what its pitfalls are. So I would probably, from what I hear, I would enter the discussion of the novel in that way. Yeah, the fictional and the autobiographical. Do you have the impression that that novel has autobiographical roots or reference? Yes.
Yes.
And it's a fictionalized autobiography?
Mm-hmm. Yes, because Montale wanted to write a diary because he was a poet, and he thought he wasn't good in fiction, but then somehow he needed fiction. And I thought he needed fiction because of this polyphony. So many Italian critics reacted that this novel isn't a diary, but it isn't a novel as well. So
okay. Yeah, 2 or 3 things about that. First, about the general question, when I think about autobiographical storytelling, I have to think about the book How Our Lives Become Stories. I have to think of Jerome Bruner and narrative psychology. And when memory studies and literary studies takes that on, it's often discussed under the term of life writing. And there is a book on life writing, memory and forgetting by, it's an Icelandic scholar, Gunnþórunn Guðmundsdóttir. So it's life writing, and it came out in Palgrave, life writing and memory, life writing and forgetting. I think that would be a good entry point. And then I think what you ask about the autobiographical is that would be the referential, is bringing us back also to the questions that Victoria has asked. Hang on, lost my thread now. First of all, a distinction made by Aleida Assmann, which I like, is there are several stages. If you have something like a raw life of a Holocaust survivor or whatever, sometimes you have the first stage, and that is literarization, meaning you write your memoirs and you use literary means in order to make them, in order to communicate better. No? And often that is mixed up in popular discourse with the next stage, and that is fictionalization. And that would really mean connecting referential elements with purely imaginary elements. Both are allowed in the system of literature, but the problem and the interesting thing is the system of literature changes as soon as it enters memory culture. And I think we've heard that in several of your contributions. We have suddenly to talk about the ethics of being referential or of being not referential. No? We find that case Will Komierski, who does as if he was a Holocaust survivor, writes his wonderful memoir, everybody reads it and likes it, and then people find out, no, he's just imagined that. No? He's, I don't know, a Swiss boy who was probably in the Second World War. And then there is a big scandal around that. And for the older guys among us in the late 80s, early 90s, that would have been anathema. That would have been, well, it's literature. Of course, we don't care about who the author is. And that has suddenly come in with the turn to memory studies. The author is important. Questions of referentiality are suddenly important. Questions of ethics are important. I read in the newspaper some weeks ago how Sebald, W.G. Sebald, is being reassessed now. I mean, he has been the big writer in memory studies. So many PhD theses written about him. Also, he never claimed that any of this stuff was autobiographical, but he did adopt and adapt other people's lives. And now we talk about the ethics of that and whether that should make us uncomfortable, that somebody of German descent should write about people in the Kindertransport who are of Jewish descent. And these questions are being now on the agenda, and I don't have, they are difficult to assess. Yeah.
Thank you. Artyom, thank
you.
Yes,
thank you. Yes, we have 3 questions in chat, and those are very detailed questions. So I guess what I do, I'll just share my screen with the file. And maybe I would ask those people who, the askers of those questions to maybe, I don't know, give the gist of the questions. So the first is Anna Schwetz from Anna.
Yes, I'm here. Thanks. Yeah, I tried to keep it short and sweet, but apparently I have failed. My question has to deal with the paper I'm going to present tomorrow, actually, on reception of popular classic and avant-garde poetry. And I am primarily working with a reference, with that image of a classic as a reference. And that's why I have picked up on a phrase that literature has no easy referentiality. And the question was, shouldn't we be really studying reference as empty fillers, empty containers that could, and the meaning thereof could be easily evacuated. So the reference could easily be reassigned to a new set of concepts. And as philologists, as scholars of text and semiotics, shouldn't we be focusing upon referential systems as embodiments of memory? Because we have been talking for, I think, half an hour, maybe an hour and a half, I haven't kept track, about mental representations and stuff like that. But what about the gist of literary studies, the text, the science? That's my question.
Yeah, and that's of course a theoretically extremely challenging question. Let me just answer a tiny part of that. I like the word empty reference, the term reminds me of empty signifiers. Yeah, I think that's something one could work with. When I wrote my PhD thesis on what these war novels like All Quiet on the Western Front did to the memory of the First World War, when they came out in the late 1920s, there were big discussions. Is this referential? A big discussion all over German newspapers. Do horses cry in war? Shout when they are dying? No? And that was discussed in earnest because it was a question of referentiality. Was it done properly in the war novels that wrote that horses would be crying, or was it done improperly? And there's an impasse there if you want to have memory literature being referential to that layer. And I think, and probably that may be going in your direction, I thought at that time, successful referentiality for memory literature is a certain referentiality to the level of the collective memory. So what are the shared narratives? What are the shared gists? What are the versions of the past that most soldiers would agree upon when they remember their engagements of 10 years ago? That was the constellation that I studied. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Then we have the question from Anastasia, I guess is the name in the chat. So can we ask Anastasia or Anastasia K to give the gist of the question?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Astrid. I really enjoyed the performances, and now my question has to deal with the chapter Literature as a Medium of Cultural Memory. And I wondered whether, as you said, the form of the narrative can predict the historical situation. So as I asked, can we then suggest that there can be no ideal narrative form for history, or can we still find objective view on history with objective narrative, as I wrote it here?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that's the big question of the theory of history. And I think people like Hayden White, and it's his ideas, no, that anarchist, radical, conservative are implications that you bring out depending on what narrative forms you use. When he stated this in the 1970s, there was an outcry among the historians who said, no, we are striving to write objective history, and we don't want this to be seen as just a narrative. But in the end, historiography tends to be narrative. It is based on selection, and it is based on combination, and it will be based on certain conventions, and it will use metaphors. There's no way around it. But it's a construct, but it's the best construct we have. We cannot get any better to get at the vast chaos of past events. We need somebody like an historian who has looked at enough sources to say, this is what I now take as the starting point. Other historians may take other starting points for any event. And this is what I think was the way it went and the main players engaged. I think the ideal case is having historians who know their trade. Second, multi-perspectivity, having the possibility of having different written histories alongside each other and to compare. And historiography also is an ongoing process. The next generation will tell the story differently. It's not objectivity in a strong sense, but I think it's the best we can have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Andrey, Logutov, could you please give the gist of your question about the gist?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I will try to. I can just read the question, I guess. There is just one question that keeps bugging me. When you, Astrid, talked about remembering the gist, and incidentally, thanks for the book recommendation, I've already looked it up. And then relaying the gist to others, we understand the gist as a fragment that is at least capable of carrying a modicum of the original meaning across. But what would you make of the cases where you remember a phrase from a song or a detail from a novel that is completely incidental and which you can't possibly in any meaningful way narrate to others? And this question, well, I can illustrate my question by two examples. Example number one, my favorite opera is Bartók's Bluebird's Castle, and it's in Hungarian. I speak some Hungarian, and I remember the lyrics word for word by heart. Although I can't really understand about 80% of the lyrics, but this is something that I remember. And this to me is kind of like in linguistic sense of the word, it's meaningless. And secondly, I think there is a bunch of literary works where the narrator doesn't narrates the events that happen to him or her in the way that indicates that their memory is not working properly. So one of the examples that just recently, like 1 minute ago, came to my mind was the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, and other things that are written in this sort of, stream of consciousness way. So yeah, I guess this is how I would put it right now.
Thank you, Andrey. And I mean, that's the important point that you've also made in your presentation. There are other forms and of remembering literature. No? We have focused on the narrative patterns and the narrative gists. And you have now also given me a new English word, the modicum, the little bit of the original meaning that is retained. Yes, as opposed to sometimes we remember just a line, just a combination of words, right, just a metaphor, or just a situation in a text, no? And nothing else from that, just how it was described that somebody was sitting in a cafe and so on. So there are obviously other forms of remembering literature, and that means of how literature moves on in its dynamics, because what we remember can always become the initial point for a next mediation. You proposed different ways of framing this, fictionality versus real world, the narrative versus the lyrical. Perhaps it's also more the narrative and more the topoi. That would be a German word, that the topoi, the condensed idea of something, but that's also again condensed. And you sometimes point to the relevance of literal remembering of a certain combination of words. We shall overcome, no?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was meaning this more in the sense of how actual memory of real people works. I don't know if there is anyone amongst the, how many, 45 people here, who will say that every memory of theirs is meaningful.
Yes, you are talking, paradoxically, you're talking about something that is pre-verbal in the verb. The way you remember that Hungarian lyrics or whatever, operatic lines, right?
Right.
You remember them pre-verbally because.
But I also remember the Coca-Cola song, and which is extremely verbal.
Yeah,
it's the pre-verbal and the verbal, right?
It has no meaning in my life. I wish I wouldn't remember it.
But you connect something with it. Affect, emotion? Is that perhaps?
Okay, it starts sounding like a therapy session.
No. No, because, you know, on the one hand, I think in the 90s with narrative psychology, people would have said, you will always, in order to make this a meaningful memory, it will always be embedded in something that can be
right. But does every memory have to be meaningful?
I think psychologists would say that we have a tendency of making it meaningful, of embedding it. And if there are non-meaningful memory fragments, then there is a tendency, and they may be wrong, to pathologize that. And then it may be traumatic or failures of encoding. But perhaps here again, literature points us to something that's there. Yeah.
Andrey, let me paraphrase myself. Instead of pre-verbal versus verbal, I'd say preconceptual versus conceptual.
Well, I could also say deliberate versus non-deliberate, yes. But I think this is an important part that somehow stays in the shade sometimes when we talk about, you know, remembering historical past or narratives.
That's yet another thing. With deliberate versus non-deliberate, you point to a distinction that in psychology is made between explicit and implicit memory systems. And when we do memory studies, we always use as a model the explicit memory systems, the knowing, cultural knowledge and how it passed on, and the remembering, past times, and that would be commemorative culture. And then there is, and I'm trying to finish an article on that right now, something that I would call the hidden world of implicit collective memory, or the hidden power. And for me, I think your example points even to another direction. For me, that's something like a cultural priming. I'm completely not aware that I am retaining all these memories in my mind, that I'm basically primed on them, but they may lead my next action into certain paths. So yeah, there is a world of non-deliberate and implicit memory, and that has collective relevance.
No, I absolutely agree with you. Thanks a lot for this particular comment, yes. Although I wouldn't necessarily agree with the statement that every single memory has to be brought to a meaning. Which I think is a kind of ideological construct that I have some, you know, problems with. But most of them should be, yes, but not all of them.
Yeah. Also, those who emphasize the meaning are concerned with autobiographical memory and identity-related narratives. No, if we don't want that, then we can think with other terms. What would the memory do? Is it a resonance? Does it resonate?
Right, but and of course you mentioned, you talked about this point that we have to deal with embodied consciousness, and we should never forget this kind of body element to the word embodied. And some things in the body are not necessarily fraught with meaning as something that can be expressly
Andrea, I think it could be.
Yeah, but, okay, yeah.
It could be phrased differently. I mean, you needn't necessarily interpret obsessively every single of your bits of memory. Yeah, bring it to the court of interpretation. I'm afraid there's at least
more questions. Yes,
more questions, and then because I guess Astrid is getting tired, so.
Yes, so we have a question from Olga Leibenka, and it's, I can read it. Can changes in cultural memory be a matter of prediction or informed guess? So that's the question.
So can you think forward about memory?
That's a good one. And I think only with the benefit of hindsight. If I was intelligent enough, I could have predicted that post-colonial memory will be a great topic in Germany at one point, because it was bound to be. Germany has a colonial history and has never really addressed it. And that could have been predicted. And now it's happening. So sometimes, yes, and most often probably no.
Yes, thank you. And we have we have three more questions from Artemyeva Victoria. So Victoria, we can ask you to maybe give the gist of the questions.
Oh, I know Victoria, and I think something's wrong with her mic. So she just can't.
Okay, so I'll just read the questions. So question number one, how does a society choose its cultural texts? What may be the criteria of texts? Usability in this capacity and function as cultural texts. So this is the first question. So how does society choose its cultural texts?
Yeah, I think that it is Aleida Assmann's term, and she would have a clear answer here. She would say, indeed, usability, and she would say the texts need to have a normative and a formative dimension. They need to convey values and norms. What should we do? They should give us a sense of collective identity. Who are we? That would be Aleida Assmann's theory of the cultural text.
Okay, so the second question, what methods can be used to study canon in the making? Are they different from those used to study canons made or established? So it's prose versus.
Yeah, that has the same challenges that memory in the making has. If you want to study that, you need different methodologies. You probably need a multi-sided ethnography, and you're always catching something that's extremely fleeting. And you might produce research that in 10 years, again, with the benefit of hindsight, turns out to have taken the wrong direction. But it will still be a good indication of one present moment and where we thought that might have led. Futures past.
Okay, and the third question, we understand that a text of cultural memory tends to be edited over time. How often, in your judgment, and under what circumstances does this develop?
Yeah, editing depends on how you see the term. My example, the Homeric epics, they were continuously, really as a manuscript edited. Stuff was thrown out because they thought it wasn't original. Then in the 18th century, in translation, editing happens because people thought that certain aspects were improper, and so they were edited out. So that's an ongoing process related to changing presences. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, we have no more questions in chat. So Tatiana, I guess.
Well, I think Astrid, you cannot even imagine how grateful we are for the time you gave us, for the wonderfully lucid and rich remarks and ideas that you shared. And all this was wonderfully inspiring and also useful, and we'll think forward from here, hopefully working towards projects, very concrete projects in between literature and memory, because obviously we have many questions, we have many plans that may be implicit yet not quite formulated or explicated even to ourselves. So unless anybody has any last thing to say at this point, may just on behalf of us all, thank you for being with us, and please get well. Take care of your throat. And that is it.
Thank you so much for this invitation. This was wonderful for me, really generative, lots of food for thought. It's a fantastic group, and I'm absolutely in favor of implicit future planning and future thinking. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a wonderfully rich discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Всего доброго. До свидания всем.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Take care, everyone.